Imagine dedicating your entire life to protecting your town, only to have your own husband vanish without a trace, and to spend 18 years wondering if the badge on your chest ever meant anything at all. In the small city of Newton, Kansas, in the autumn of 1995, a police officer's husband walked out of his house after a strange phone call in the middle of the night, and he was never seen again. For nearly 2 decades, the only evidence of what happened to him was a radio transmission that everyone remembered hearing, and that officially, according to every record the department kept, never happened at all. This is the story of Daniel Carpenter, and of the wife who wore a badge for 18 years while searching for the truth about the one person she could never protect. If you're new to this channel, welcome. And if a case like this pulls you in the way it pulled us in, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because there's a lot more where this came from, and we'd love to know where in the world you're watching from tonight, so drop it in the comments below. Newton, Kansas sits in the flat farmland of Harvey County, a town built on the bones of the old Santa Fe Railway, where grain elevators rise over the horizon like grey cathedrals, and the wind moves through wheat fields with a sound some long-time residents describe as almost human, a low, continuous murmur that never quite stops, even on the stillest days. In the autumn, when the wheat had long since been cut, and the stubble fields stretched pale and gold toward a horizon broken only by the occasional windbreak of cottonwoods, the whole county seemed to hold its breath before winter, the light growing thin and slanted by late afternoon, the temperature dropping fast enough after sunset that porch lights came on early and stayed on late. In 1995, Newton had a population hovering just under 17,000 people, small enough that most residents recognized each other's cars on Main Street, small enough that the checkout girl at the Dillons knew half her customers by name, and small enough that when something happened to one family, it happened in some quieter way to everyone. The town had one hospital, 2 high schools, a handful of churches whose bells still rang on the hour, a Carnegie library with oak reading tables worn smooth by decades of elbows, and a police department housed in a squat brick building on Broadway Street that had been renovated only once since the 1960s. Its windows still fitted with the same aluminum frames, its holding cells still cooled by window units that rattled through every summer. It was the kind of place where screen doors were left unlocked through the warm months, where teenagers cruised the same 3 blocks downtown on Friday nights with their windows down and the radio turned up, and where the biggest crimes most years were burglaries at the grain co-op or the occasional bar fight spilling out onto the sidewalk after last call at one of the 2 taverns near the rail yard. People in Newton described their town, when asked, with a particular kind of pride that had less to do with anything remarkable happening there, and more to do with the fact that nothing remarkable ever needed to. That was the entire point. Nothing happened in Newton. That was what made the autumn of 1995 so difficult for the town to metabolize afterward, the way a body sometimes cannot process a wound that arrives without warning in a place that had never been struck before. Carol Carpenter had grown up 20 minutes outside of town. On a wheat farm her family had worked for 3 generations, the daughter of a quiet, sun-weathered farmer named Wesley Carr, and a schoolteacher named Judith, who taught 3rd grade at the same elementary school Carol herself had once attended. Carol was the middle of 3 children, and by her own later account she had been from a very young age the kind of child who noticed when something was wrong before anyone said a word, the one who would quietly check on a younger cousin crying in a corner of a crowded family gathering while the adults were still occupied elsewhere. She had wanted to be a police officer since she was 11 years old. When a Harvey County Sheriff's deputy helped her find a lost dog along the section line road near her family's property and spent 20 minutes crouched in the ditch beside her, talking her through what to do next, patient and calm in a way that struck her even then as a kind of quiet heroism, entirely unlike the sirens and chases version of police work she'd seen on television. She remembered, decades later, the deputy's exact words to her, that most of the job wasn't about being brave in a single dramatic moment. It was about being steady for people on what might be the worst day of their lives. She joined the Newton Police Department in 1989 at the age of 23, one of only 3 women on a force of 31 officers, and she wore that distinction the way some people wear an old injury, aware of it always, but rarely speaking of it directly. Her training officer in her first year, a heavy-set veteran named Sergeant Pratt, who had 15 years on the department and opinions about most things, had told her flatly during her second week that she wouldn't last a year. She stayed 6, and then 16, and then 27, until she was one of the most respected officers to ever wear the Newton badge. But in 1995, she was still 29 years old, still a patrol officer, still 6 years into proving something to a department that had mostly by then stopped needing convincing. She was known around the station for a kind of unshakable steadiness that colleagues genuinely valued. The officer other cops wanted riding with them during a domestic disturbance or a bad wreck out on Highway 50, because she never seemed to raise her voice, never seemed to let a situation slip away from her, and always seemed to know exactly which words would calm a frightened person down. She had met Daniel Carpenter at a 4th of July barbecue in 1990, at the home of a mutual friend, and the story Carol told for the rest of her life was that she had noticed him first not talking to her, but crouched by the above-ground pool, helping a group of small children figure out how to work a broken pool skimmer, entirely absorbed in the task, patient with each child's suggestion, even when it was useless. They married 2 years later, in the spring of 1992, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church on Main Street, the same church where Daniel had been baptized as an infant and where his own parents had married 29 years earlier. They bought a modest 3-bedroom house on Cedar Street, 6 blocks from downtown, the kind of house with a detached garage and a big cottonwood tree in the backyard that dropped cotton fluff across the lawn every June. And they had, by every account given later by neighbors and friends and family, an unremarkable and deeply contented marriage, the kind built less on grand gestures than on 1,000 small daily accommodations that outsiders rarely see and rarely think to ask about. Daniel Carpenter was, by nearly every account given later by people who had known him, one of the gentlest men in Newton. At 31 years old, he worked as the head custodian at Newton High School, a job he had held since he was 23. And he was the kind of employee that schools quietly depend on and rarely thank enough. The man who knew which classroom radiators clanged in January, which door in the East Wing stuck when it rained, which students lingered in the hallway after the final bell because home wasn't somewhere they were in a hurry to get back to. Teachers said Daniel remembered the names of students who had graduated years earlier and would ask about them by name if he ran into their parents at the grocery store. The school secretary, a woman named Ellen Rhodes, who had worked the front office for over a decade, said he brought her coffee every morning without being asked, black with 1 sugar, and that he had done it for so long she couldn't remember when it started or why. Only that some mornings it was the only kind thing that happened to her before 9 o'clock. He coached a youth baseball team in the summer, the Cedar Street Cardinals, made up mostly of kids from the neighborhood whose parents couldn't always make it to practice. And he fixed his elderly neighbor Mrs. Thornton's storm door every autumn, without being asked, arriving with his own toolbox on the first genuinely cold Saturday of the season.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
Like clockwork. He had, according to nearly everyone who spoke about him later, an almost total absence of enemies, a fact that struck people as remarkable even before it became, in time, one of the most troubling details of the entire case. Because a man with no enemies is a man whose disappearance offers investigators nothing at all to grab onto. No jealous rival, no bitter debt, no jilted lover, nothing but a hole in the shape of a person who had apparently wronged no one in his entire adult life. What almost no one knew, not even Carol at first, was that in the weeks before he disappeared, Daniel had begun noticing something that troubled him deeply. Something connected not to his own quiet work at the school, but strangely and uncomfortably to the police department where his wife served. As part of a minor renovation project that autumn, the high school had loaned some of its older filing cabinets and storage furniture to the city, including several pieces that ended up, briefly, in the storage annex behind the Newton Police Department, while the department waited on a shipment of new evidence lockers that had been delayed twice already by the manufacturer. Daniel had been asked, as a favor to the district's facilities coordinator, to help move some of the old furniture during a weekend in September, spending 2 Saturday mornings hauling filing cabinets and stacking chairs in the cramped, poorly lit annex behind the department's brick building. Work he did without complaint because that was simply how Daniel was. In the process of clearing out one of the older cabinets to make room, he found a stack of maintenance requisition forms and equipment purchase orders that had been shoved carelessly into a bottom drawer instead of properly filed. The kind of paperwork clutter that accumulates in any municipal building over the years and rarely draws a second glance. He was not a man who went looking for trouble, and by every account he almost put the papers back without reading them at all. But something about the numbers on those requisition forms bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately explain. A nagging arithmetic itch of the kind that came naturally to a man who had spent 8 years balancing a school custodial budget down to the last box of chalk and roll of paper towels. Equipment listed as purchased that he never recalled seeing arrive. Repair invoices for patrol vehicles that, according to the maintenance schedule, Carol sometimes mentioned casually at the dinner table, complaining about a cruiser still making a strange sound the shop was supposed to have fixed months earlier, appeared to describe work that had never actually happened. Small numbers, individually forgettable, easy to dismiss as clerical sloppiness, but adding up across dozens of forms spanning nearly 2 years to something that simply didn't sit right in his mind. Daniel didn't go to his wife with it, not at first, and he didn't go to anyone else either. Those who understood him best said this was entirely in character, a man who preferred quiet certainty before speaking, who would rather patiently verify a suspicion on his own time than raise an alarm that might embarrass someone unfairly over what could, after all, turn out to be nothing more than sloppy bookkeeping. He began, in his own methodical and almost bureaucratic way, keeping a small spiral notebook, the plain kind he normally used for grocery lists and school supply inventories, and he started copying down dates, dollar amounts, and initials from documents he had access to only because of that one favor of moving furniture, documents he was never supposed to have seen at all. He mentioned to a co-worker at the school weeks later that he was working on a little side project, and laughed it off when she asked what he meant, saying it was nothing, just some paperwork he was helping sort through, a comment so characteristically modest that she thought nothing more of it for 18 years. That notebook, small and unremarkable, would not surface again with any real scrutiny until 2013. The last day anyone saw Daniel Carpenter began as ordinarily as any day in his life. He worked his usual shift at Newton High School, left at 4 in the afternoon after locking up the gymnasium and setting the boiler for the evening, stopped at the Dillons on Main Street to pick up groceries for a pot roast he intended to make, and prepared dinner that evening for himself and Carol, who was working the overnight patrol shift that week, a rotation the department cycled its officers through every 6 weeks. Around 9 o'clock that evening, Daniel's mother, A widow named Ruth Carpenter, who lived across town, called the house to talk through plans for the upcoming Thanksgiving gathering, and later told investigators that Daniel sounded completely normal on the phone, tired but cheerful, mentioning only in passing that he might stay up a little later than usual because he had some things to finish going through, a phrase she remembered clearly only because of everything that came after, though at the time it registered as nothing at all. Carol's mother, Judith, was staying the night in the guest room to keep Daniel company while Carol worked her overnight shift, a common arrangement in a household where the couple had grown used to accommodating the strange rhythms of police work. Sometime after 11, the home phone rang in the kitchen. Judith, half asleep in the guest room down the hall, later told investigators she heard the phone ring only once before it stopped, heard Daniel's voice answer in the kitchen, low and indistinct through the wall, and heard his tone shift after a moment into something quieter and more clipped than his usual easy warmth. Though at the time, drifting in and out of sleep, she couldn't have said exactly why it struck her as unusual. She heard him say, distinctly enough that the words stayed with her for the rest of her life, "Okay, I'll come." And then she heard the back door open and close, followed by the sound of his truck starting in the driveway and pulling away into the cold November night. At 11:42 that night, Newton police dispatcher Louise Barker was working the overnight console at the Broadway Street station, a job she had held for 11 years and knew as well as she knew her own kitchen, when she received a radio transmission that would haunt her for the remainder of her career. It came through on the department's main channel, a burst of static, followed by a male voice she did not immediately recognize, speaking fast and low, saying something fragmented about the school, about needing someone to come out to the maintenance yard behind the football field, before the transmission cut out entirely into a wall of static and then silence. Louise, following procedure without a second thought, tried twice to raise the caller again on the same channel and got nothing but empty air. She logged what she could remember of the call in her handwritten dispatch notes, the way overnight dispatchers still did in 1995, even with the department's brand-new computer logging system installed only that spring, because the computer system was known department-wide to be unreliable, prone to dropped entries during the transition period, and most of the veteran dispatchers, Louise included, kept a paper backup out of long habit and genuine distrust of the new equipment. She assumed, reasonably enough at the time, that it was either a prank or bleed-through interference from another frequency, a common enough nuisance with the department's aging radio repeaters. She never connected it that night to anything at all, and went back to the quiet, uneventful rhythm of an overnight shift in a town where nothing ever happened. Carol Carpenter came home from her shift at 7 the next morning to a house that felt, before she even opened the door, subtly wrong in a way she couldn't immediately name. Her mother was still asleep in the guest room. There was no sign of Daniel anywhere. His truck was gone from the driveway, which registered at first as nothing alarming. He sometimes ran early morning errands before she got home, but his wallet sat on the kitchen counter exactly where he always left it overnight, beside his keys to the school and a folded grocery receipt from the day before, and the pot roast he had planned for dinner sat untouched in the refrigerator, the dishes from his own solitary meal the night before still washed and stacked neatly in the drying rack, everything in its place except the one thing that mattered. There was no note, no sign of forced entry, no indication that anything had gone wrong beyond the simple, quietly devastating fact that Daniel Carpenter was not there and had apparently left sometime in the night without telling anyone why. Her mother, woken and still groggy, told her that she thought she'd heard the back door sometime after 11, and that in the fog of being pulled from sleep, she had simply assumed Daniel had stepped outside for a moment to check on something in the garage, to look at the stars the way he sometimes did on clear, cold nights, nothing worth getting up for. Carol stood in her own kitchen, still in her uniform, badge still pinned to her chest, radio still clipped to her shoulder, and felt for the first time in her 6 years on the force what it truly meant to have absolutely no idea what to do next. The terrible vertigo of every instinct her training had given her suddenly having nowhere at all to land. The Newton Police Department response that morning moved with the particular urgency that comes from a missing person case involving one of their own family. Within an hour, nearly a dozen officers, on duty and off, were canvassing the neighborhood around the Carpenter house on Cedar Street, knocking on doors up and down the block, asking neighbors whether they had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. By midday, searches had expanded to the wooded area behind Newton High School and the open ground surrounding the maintenance yard where Daniel spent most of his waking hours. Officers walking grid patterns through the dead grass along the football field fence line, while a handful of teachers and students, informed of Daniel's disappearance by a somber announcement over the school intercom, stood watching from the parking lot with an expression of disbelief that would not fully lift from the building for weeks. Investigators in 1995 worked with tools that would seem almost unimaginable within a generation. No cell phone records to pull because Daniel didn't own one. No security cameras covering the maintenance yard or the streets around the Carpenter house. No way to trace a radio transmission back to its point of origin beyond questioning every officer on duty about whether they recognized the voice, and no way to know, with any real certainty, whether a man had walked away from his own life or been taken from it. Search dogs were brought in from the Harvey County Sheriff's Office on the second day, working the property line behind the school and the drainage ditches along the county road that ran past the Carpenter house. And for 3 days, the search consumed nearly every off-duty hour the department could spare. Officers walking shoulder to shoulder through harvested wheat fields under a low grey November sky, calling Daniel's name into a wind that seemed to swallow the sound before it traveled 10 feet. Volunteers from the community joined by the dozens. Parents of Daniel's baseball players showing up with their own trucks and flashlights, church groups organizing search lines through the timber along the creek south of town. The kind of outpouring that happens in small places when a genuinely well-liked person goes missing and no one can quite believe it. It was on the second day of the search that Louise Barker remembered the radio transmission from the night before, turning it over in her mind through a restless, sleepless day off, and brought her handwritten dispatch log into Detective Frank Owens, the investigator assigned to lead the case, a 22-year veteran of the department known for a methodical, unhurried approach to investigation that some younger officers privately found frustrating, but that had closed more cases over the years than almost anyone else on the force. She described the voice as male, agitated, mentioning the school and the maintenance yard before cutting to static, and told Owens she could not place it as belonging to anyone she recognized, though the transmission had been brief and distorted enough that she couldn't rule much out either. Owens pulled the department's new computer dispatch log for that night and found nothing at all corresponding to Louise's account. No record of any transmission on the main channel between 11 and midnight, a gap that struck him as strange, but not entirely implausible, given how frequently the new system had been dropping entries during its rocky first months of operation, a known issue the department's IT vendor had promised to address in an upcoming software patch. He noted Louise's account carefully in his case file, flagged it as a possible lead connected to Daniel's disappearance from the maintenance yard, an area the truck itself had never actually been found near, and moved forward operating on the reasonable assumption that the discrepancy was simply another instance of the new equipment's ongoing unreliability. It was the kind of detail that, in a department with more resources, more staff, and more time, might have been pursued far more aggressively, cross-checked against every officer's whereabouts that night, chased down through the radio vendor's own equipment logs. In Newton, With an active search consuming nearly every available hour and a community in visible shock, it became simply one item, unresolved, but not urgent, in a growing list of things that didn't quite add up. Roy Nash became a person of interest within the first week, not because of any direct evidence connecting him to Daniel's disappearance, but because of a friction that several officers mentioned almost reluctantly when Detective Owens began interviewing the department's own patrol staff, a task made uncomfortable by the fact that Carol herself was one of their own. Nash, 36 years old at the time and 8 years into his career with the Newton Department, had worked patrol alongside Carol for 4 years and was generally well regarded, competent, a little gruff. The kind of officer who kept mostly to himself outside of work, but colleagues described a professional relationship between him and Daniel that had cooled sharply, almost imperceptibly to anyone not paying close attention, after Daniel, helping move furniture that September, had apparently seen Nash searching through files in the storage annex in a manner Daniel later described, in an offhand comment to a co-worker at the school, as acting like he didn't want to be seen doing it. When questioned, Nash denied any unusual behavior, insisted he'd simply been retrieving some personal items he'd stored temporarily in the annex during a bout of home renovations, and produced his patrol log for the night of Daniel's disappearance, showing him on a documented traffic stop 9 miles outside town at 11:45 that evening. 4 minutes after the radio transmission, Louise Barker remembered receiving a record corroborated by a citation he'd issued that night for a broken taillight to a driver who, when contacted weeks later, confirmed the stop had indeed occurred exactly as logged. On paper, the alibi appeared entirely solid, an official record generated independently of Nash himself, time-stamped and witnessed by a citizen with no reason to lie. Detective Owens noted the timing tension between Nash's account and Daniel's earlier comment about the storage annex, noted the odd coincidence, and with nothing more substantial to work from and an alibi that checked out cleanly against an independent record, set his suspicion of Nash quietly aside, unable to justify pursuing a man whose whereabouts that night were more thoroughly documented than almost anyone else's in Newton. For Carol, the following weeks unfolded as a blur of press conferences she couldn't bring herself to watch back later on the evening news. Community search parties, organized by Daniel's baseball players and their parents, that continued well past the point the department's own official search had scaled back, and a growing unbearable silence from the investigation itself, days passing with no new information. Then a week, then 2. The department posted flyers throughout Harvey County and the surrounding counties, ran appeals on the local radio station and in the pages of the Newton Kansan, and fielded a modest but steady number of tips from the public, none of which led anywhere concrete. A long-haul trucker reported seeing a man, matching Daniel's general description, walking along the shoulder of Highway 50 2 days after the disappearance, a lead that consumed nearly a week of investigative time. Officers driving the length of the highway, checking gas stations and diners along the route, before being ruled out entirely when the man turned out to be a hitchhiker from Salina with no connection to Newton whatsoever. A hunter found a jacket snagged on a fence post in a ditch 11 miles from town that briefly seized the department's full attention until Carol asked to come identify it in a small evidence room that smelled of dust and old coffee. Confirmed through tears that it wasn't Daniel's, that the color was wrong, that Daniel didn't own a jacket like that at all. By Christmas of 1995, the search had scaled back to a skeleton effort, a handful of officers keeping half an eye on the case between their regular patrol duties, checking in periodically with the family, following up on the occasional tip that trickled in, and by the following spring, the file had effectively gone cold, still technically open, still occupying a drawer in Detective Owens's filing cabinet, but no longer actively worked by anyone with any real hope of resolution. Ruth Carpenter, Daniel's mother, held a small memorial service at the Methodist Church in the spring of 1996, a decision made carefully and painfully with Carol's input, not a funeral, never spoken of as a funeral, but a gathering to grieve the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing, attended by nearly the entire congregation and dozens more from across town, including a young lieutenant named Owen Ferguson, who stood near the back of the sanctuary in his dress uniform and spoke afterward to Carol with what she remembered for years as genuine and comforting warmth. Carol did not leave the department. Colleagues later said this surprised no one who knew her and devastated everyone who loved her. She stayed on patrol through 1996 and into the years that followed, rising eventually to sergeant in 2001, then to detective in 2006, carrying out the ordinary, exhausting work of small-town policing in the same uniform, on the same streets, in the same department that had never solved the disappearance of her own husband, a fact that colleagues learned over the years simply not to bring up unless she raised it first. She kept Daniel's spiral notebook, discovered by her mother while gently packing away some of his things nearly a year after he vanished, in a drawer in her bedroom, without fully understanding what the cramped columns of numbers and initials scrawled inside it actually meant, assuming in her grief that it was simply some ordinary piece of Daniel's meticulous, methodical nature. Notes for the school budget, perhaps, or an inventory list for the baseball team's equipment. Something too painful to examine closely at the time, and not obviously connected to his disappearance in any way she could see. She would not open that notebook again with real scrutiny for 17 years. The department itself changed slowly across those years in ways that mattered more than anyone realized at the time. The paper dispatch logs Louise Barker had kept out of long habit in 1995 were digitized in 2001 as part of a records modernization grant the city received from the state. Boxes of decades-old handwritten notes, scanned page by page and archived into a searchable database, a project completed by a part-time records clerk named Patricia Yates, working through the material with diligence but little particular urgency, and no reason at all to suspect that any single entry among thousands might one day matter enormously. Lieutenant Owen Ferguson, who had been a young officer present during part of the original 1995 search effort, rose steadily through the department over the following decade, respected across Harvey County for modernizing the force's aging equipment, securing federal and state grants for new patrol vehicles and communication systems, and cultivating a public image as the kind of chief who remembered the names of his officers' children and showed up personally to every department funeral and retirement dinner. He was named chief of the Newton Police Department in 2004, a promotion celebrated at a banquet Carol herself attended, sitting near the front of the room, applauding along with everyone else. Roy Nash left the department in 2003 for a lateral position with the Harvey County Sheriff's Office, a routine career move nobody thought twice about at the time, chasing slightly better pay and a shorter commute from the farm outside town where he'd settled with his wife. And each November, as the anniversary of Daniel's disappearance came and went, the Newton Kansan ran a short update, usually only a paragraph tucked well inside the paper, noting that the case remained officially unsolved, that officer and later detective Daniel Carpenter had declined to comment beyond a brief, carefully worded statement that she had not given up hope, a sentence she repeated with slight variations for so many consecutive years that a young reporter once asked her, not unkindly, whether she still believed it herself. Carol had looked at him for a long moment before answering that belief. At a certain point, stopped being a feeling and became simply a discipline, something you practiced whether or not it came naturally anymore. The case that finally cracked open began not with new evidence, but with an unrelated audit. In the spring of 2013, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation began a routine cold case review across several small departments in the region, part of a broader state initiative encouraging local agencies to revisit unsolved disappearances using digital cross-referencing tools that hadn't existed decades earlier, and offering modest grant funding to departments willing to dedicate staff hours to the effort. Detective Grace Sharp, 38 years old, had joined the Newton Police Department only 4 years prior, after 11 years with the much larger Wichita Police Department, and she carried with her an outsider's willingness to question assumptions that had long since settled into institutional memory, the kind of quiet skepticism that comes from not having personally lived through the original investigation and its accumulated frustrations. Assigned to review the Carpenter file as part of the KBI initiative, she began by doing something almost no one had done in nearly 2 decades, reading every single page of the original 1995 case file in full, start to finish, including Louise Barker's handwritten dispatch note from the night of the disappearance, a detail that had been mentioned in Detective Owens's original report, but never meaningfully pursued once the department's computer log showed no corresponding entry. Grace requested the department's complete, digitized dispatch archive from the 2001 Records Modernization Project and spent 3 weeks methodically cross-referencing every radio transmission logged on the night of November 14, 1995, against the department's separate archive of officer duty logs, citation records, and vehicle assignment sheets, material that had never before been directly compared against the dispatch data because no one in 18 years had ever had specific reason to look for a discrepancy between the two. What she found troubled her immediately. The digitized dispatch log, scanned from Louise's original paper notes, showed her handwritten entry for the 11:42 transmission clearly, time-stamped and initialed the way Louise always closed out her overnight notes, a small, ordinary piece of routine record-keeping. But the department's parallel computer system, the one installed in early 1995 that Detective Owens had assumed simply failed to record the call, showed something different on closer inspection. Not an absence of data during that time window at all, but a single line of metadata that had been manually flagged and excluded from the searchable index. A technical distinction the original 1995 investigation had no reason to know existed, because the software's exclusion function was buried deep in an administrative menu no working detective would ever have thought to check. Grace brought in the city's current IT contractor to examine the original system architecture, preserved almost miraculously on backup tapes the department had never gotten around to disposing of, and learned that the exclusion flag on that specific line of dispatch data had been set manually by someone holding system administrator access 3 days after Daniel Carpenter's disappearance. In 1995, only 2 people in the entire department held that level of access to the newly installed system, the IT vendor's on-site installation technician, who had left the state years earlier and was quickly ruled out through employment records placing him in Topeka on unrelated contract work that entire week, and Lieutenant Owen Ferguson, who had personally championed the department's computer modernization project from its earliest planning stages and had overseen its installation that spring with unusual hands-on involvement for an officer of his rank. This single thread, once pulled, unraveled with a...
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
Speed that surprised even Grace herself. Cross-referencing Ferguson's own 1995 duty logs against the newly re-examined dispatch data, She found that he had signed out a patrol vehicle at 10:40 that night, nearly an hour before the transmission Louise received, logged in his own handwriting as responding to what his paperwork described only as a property check, a category of call so routine and so poorly documented in 1995 that it raised no flags whatsoever at the time it was filed. The property in question, according to a barely legible notation squeezed into the margin of the vehicle log, was the high school maintenance yard, the exact location referenced in the fragmented radio transmission Louise had logged that same night. Grace requested Daniel Carpenter's personal belongings from the family as part of her review, and Carol, now a detective herself, with nearly 2 decades on the job and a lifetime of instinct about when a case was finally moving, retrieved the spiral notebook from her bedroom drawer for the first time in years and handed it over without knowing what, if anything, it might contain. What Grace found inside, once she painstakingly cross-referenced the dates, dollar figures, and initials against the department's own 1994 and 1995 equipment purchase records, was a pattern Daniel had been quietly, methodically documenting for weeks before he died, a series of maintenance and equipment purchases authorized under Lieutenant Ferguson's own signature, invoiced and paid by the city, for vehicle repairs and communications equipment that department records showed were never actually performed or delivered at all. Funds redirected instead, as later forensic accounting firmly established, into a private account Ferguson had quietly opened under a cousin's name in a bank 2 counties away. The 2-tier nature of what happened next emerged carefully over months of painstaking follow-up investigation. Roy Nash, brought in for a second interview after 18 years, sitting across a table from Grace Sharp in a room he had once patrolled the halls outside of as a young officer, admitted under gentle but persistent pressure that he had, in fact, been searching through the storage annex files that September of 1995, not for anything related to Ferguson's fraud specifically, but because he had been privately investigating his own vague suspicion that a superior officer, a suspicion he refused for nearly 2 decades to name even to himself, was misusing departmental equipment funds. He had seen enough that September to feel deeply uneasy, said nothing to anyone out of a very real fear for his own career and standing in a small department where everyone knew everyone, and buried the memory so completely that it took Grace's careful, patient questioning to force it back to the surface after all that time. Nash's ironclad alibi from 1995, the traffic citation issued 9 miles outside town, remained entirely genuine, corroborated independently by a citizen with no reason to lie decades earlier. He had not been involved in Daniel's disappearance at all. He had simply been another man circling the edges of the same secret, too afraid, for 18 years, to say aloud what he had only ever allowed himself to suspect. The full picture, ultimately reconstructed through Ferguson's own confession in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation, described a phone call Ferguson made to the Carpenter house that November night in 1995, having learned through Patricia Yates, the records clerk, later identified and charged as an accomplice, that Daniel had been quietly asking pointed questions about certain equipment invoices during casual conversation at a school district budget meeting she happened to attend. Ferguson asked Daniel to meet him at the maintenance yard that night, framing it as an opportunity to sort out a misunderstanding before it became anything larger. And when Daniel arrived carrying his small spiral notebook, a confrontation in the dark, empty yard behind the football field ended in Daniel's death, his body driven that same night to a remote section of farmland Ferguson's own family had once owned northeast of town, long since sold off, but still familiar to him from childhood, and buried in a location investigators would not locate until Ferguson himself, facing overwhelming and mounting evidence, finally agreed to lead them there in the summer of 2013. The radio transmission Louise Barker received at 11:42 that night had come from Daniel's own truck-mounted CB unit. A desperate and partial call for help transmitted in the moments before Ferguson reached him. One that Ferguson, arriving at the department early the following week, under the entirely unremarkable pretense of routine system maintenance, quietly and deliberately excluded from the digital record, using the very administrative access privileges his own modernization project had granted him. Patricia Yates, the records clerk who had unwittingly and then knowingly tipped Ferguson off in 1995, was charged in 2014 with obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact, receiving a sentence of 3 years after cooperating fully with prosecutors and testifying with visible remorse that Ferguson had promised her a promotion in exchange for her silence about the equipment invoices, a promotion she did in fact receive the following year, and one she said she had come to deeply regret accepting for the rest of her working life. Ferguson himself, 60 years old by the time of his 2014 trial, silver-haired and composed in a way that unsettled several courtroom observers, was convicted on charges of first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and multiple counts of fraud, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Roy Nash, though never charged with any crime himself, faced quiet, unofficial scrutiny within the department for years afterward over his long silence, and retired from the sheriff's office not long after the trial concluded, telling a local reporter only that some regrets never fully leave a person, no matter how much time passes. Daniel Carpenter stood in the Harvey County Courthouse in the spring of 2014, 18 years and 5 months after her husband walked out their back door into a cold November night, and watched the man who had once shaken her hand warmly at department banquets, who had spoken at Daniel's own memorial service in 1996 with words she had, for years, genuinely found comforting, be sentenced for his murder. She did not speak to reporters afterward beyond a single sentence, delivered quietly and evenly on the courthouse steps as cameras clicked around her, that she had never fully stopped believing the truth would find its way home eventually, even in the years when believing it felt almost impossible to sustain. She retired from the Newton Police Department 2 years later, in 2016, after 27 years of service to a town that had, in the end, given her back the one answer she had spent nearly her entire career quietly waiting for. Daniel's spiral notebook, the modest, unremarkable object that had waited 17 years in a bedroom drawer before anyone understood what it truly contained, now sits in a small glass case at the Harvey County Historical Museum, donated by Carol herself, alongside a brief placard describing the case simply as a reminder that even the quietest kind of courage can, given enough time, finally be heard. The maintenance yard behind Newton High School was repaved in 2017 as part of a broader campus renovation, and today it looks, by every outward appearance, like any other stretch of asphalt behind any other American high school, indistinguishable from 1,000 other places where nothing unusual has ever happened, and where, for 18 long years, the truth simply waited to be found. This video is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All names, characters, locations, and events depicted are entirely fictional and are not based on any real individuals, actual missing person cases, or real criminal investigations. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental and unintentional.